how to use an example of one. We can do it in a very basic React app. We're not going to do anything super complicated. And then talk a little bit about just what working with APIs lets you accomplish, because there's a lot of things that you can do with when you start getting into that, right? So the basics of working with any API really is, up until this point, any application that we've built has worked with data that we put into the app, right? It's stuff that either we type in through the app, or it's available to us from our content. But there's so many great, like, the internet is made up of all these great sort of products and other things with information and data and other stuff for us that would be awesome to be able to consume instead of having to do everything ourselves, or be able to add into our products to add features, to leverage the capabilities that come from that, right? And that's what an API lets you do. So an API is just like, let me make sure I get the term right, but it should just stand for, so it just means a way to talk to another application. How do you talk to a different application and get information out of me? And so I'll use today the Giphy API that's in this example that was sent, or the tutorial, and sort of walk through just an example there. And then we might even, I'll pull up a list of other APIs. We can talk about them. If we want to try and use one of those, we can give it a shot as well, though I haven't set anything up for them. But I think Giphy gives a good example of working with an API. So most APIs are going to have very, very similar patterns when you work with them and you're trying to do something and get data out. The first thing you're going to want to do is you sort of go find their documentation for whatever you're interested in. And maybe somebody's interested in something else. Like I said, we'll go through Giphy, and if somebody has like a website they like, a feature they want to add to something, we'll see if we can find an example, see if they have an API, and play with that as well. But when you find the documentation, most APIs nowadays, not necessarily all of them, but most of them require you to have an API key to access them. And that's to make sure that they want to be able to limit how many times people are hitting their server, so you're not just spamming them or doing something else. And a lot of times, if you're using it a lot, they may want you to pay to access that data, so that they can make some money off that, or they can get a little something out of these integrations. So here you can, on Giphy, you can just go up there, create an account, and then it's very easy. Just create, like, say, here's my app. I just created a simple one, called it like React tutorial, and then here's the API key that it gave me to work with. So once you've done that and you've got this API key, the question is, what do you do with that? How do I work with this Giphy API at all? What does it even mean to have this Giphy API? And tell you, here's a lot of Giphy highlights and stickers and etc. Well, down here you get the code examples, and in everything they're going to have some example of how do you call our API. What's the process to make a request to it? So all of this is examples in a whole bunch of different languages, but really all it is, if for the most part, for most APIs nowadays, what you're doing is making some sort of HTTP request of some kind. So this is just the same as any other HTTP call that you can make. But this one told me invalid authentication credentials, and that's because it's saying, oh, you need your actual API key here instead of what you just did. So you notice I didn't even have to do anything complicated in order to test this out. Oops, not where I intended to go. So I'll just put my API key here. And what we get back is the result of this request to Giphy for information. So we can start looking at what this looks like, and it'll vary based off different API endpoints. But you've got your base URL portion of the API, pretty common for everything. Usually they're versioned in some way, as we are here, like version 1 of the GIFs. And we're doing a search. And then you get this is where it's useful to know the different parts of a URL. So these are the like search terms after the canonical portion of the URL. This is the the route. And these are the, yeah, that's their example that they have. So then these are the actual parameters that you're passing in, right? So these are all your optional parameters. And what we can see here is, take a guess, we're doing a query for Ryan Gosling. And then we give it our API key and we tell it, give us only 5 results, as I'm guessing what that says. And if you go look at their documentation, they're going to have much more detailed technical documentation down here about how to make this request, like what the different parameters are. And these shouldn't need to be in any given order, but they're going to have a lot more detailed information around this stuff. You can tell it, give me stuff only with a specific rating, and this will all vary by whatever API you're talking to get data. So there's going to be a lot of variance in how they work, but all of them are going to be somewhat similar. And then you also need to learn, like the documentation will also tell you what the results look like what's the structure of it. But a lot of times you'll get an example. Like here's some examples of what happens when you do the request, and you can just see what it looks like right here, right? We made a request. Here's an example of what it looks like. It looks like we have what we get back is this JavaScript object or JSON object, if you will, with a data property, a pagination property, and a meta property on it. Meta looks like it's telling you what the response was, that it was a good response. Pagination, I'm guessing that's telling me there are 23,177 Ryan Gosling GIFs available. We got the first 5. And then if we look here, data, looks like we have 5 results there, right? So I'll bet you those are the 5 things we have. And each one of those has a whole bunch of structure and data in it as well. So that's, I mean, at its most basic level, that's the concept of working with APIs. Is anywhere you want to go work with somebody's API, you usually have an API key, and then you can make requests and get data. Now, sometimes you'll even be able to get data in different formats. This is JSON. Some may support getting data back as XML. Some may have a different interface than just a straight URL. There's other ways to request stuff. This is known as RESTful, or at least it's close to a RESTful type API. And that's really easy to work with and develop around. But there's other major protocols, this high level. SOAP is one that was really popular for a long time. And there's some other ones that are more lightweight, so they're not quite as heavy as RESTful. But this is, most stuff you're going to encounter, you're probably going to be able to work with this same sort of approach. So now the next question you have is, what do we do with this, right? How do we leverage this? And if we already got a little bit of a, just used create React app to start a very basic React. So let's play with this for just a little while, build something very basic out, and then take a few minutes to look at some other options. Or if somebody has something specifically we want to look at, we can go do that next. But particularly in a React app, let's look at what you would want to do to work with an API. Well, the first thing I did actually is you can pull up their documentation. They'll talk about how do I make an AJAX call, and that's typically the term used, or APIs for getting data from somewhere else, another site. And there's a lot of legacy reasons as to why stuff is called AJAX. Doesn't really need to be known. It stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML, but the gist is it's when you're making an API call. So they even give you some tips here on how to do some of this stuff. And some of that includes, you can use some of these libraries to help make your calls, because it makes it a lot easier than using the old methods that were built into the browser. And window.fetch is a new standard that's rolling out to browsers that a lot of these other ones sort of backfill. It suggests, okay, maybe you want to make the call in component did mount, is where they're suggesting you do it. So that's the lifecycle function for your React component, right? And we've seen a few of these lifecycle functions, component did update, et cetera, that we've leveraged. And then they even give us an example of working with this. So here's an example of working with an API. Well, let's, first things first, in your constructor, let's go ahead and set some initial state for what we've got. And you can see I'm doing pretty much the same thing. I've got my constructor, I call the super, and then I just set my items to null for the state. I could also call this gifts if I want to, because that's, you know, what I want to get back out of this, the thing that I sort of care about. And what you'll notice is there were a couple of other pieces of state that they set here, which is really useful in terms of building something out effectively. We may add some of those in just a minute. I'm going to start with just this little gifts bit. We'll act like everything's going to go perfect and start to see some of the reasons to add other bits in. So if you've got your initial state set, now you want to make your request in component did mount. And I'm going to hard code this request the same way that I did just a moment ago on the URL in my browser. And then hopefully we'll bit by bit pull this out and make it more flexible, easier for us to work with. But I'm using, this is just using fetch. This is, again, it'll even sort of tell you what this is, but this is a way to make a request for data to a server of some kind, right? Fetch is part of the newer standard for HTML, but it's also, or JavaScript in the DOM, but it's backfilled into these applications through Create React app using, I think, Axios or something like that as well. I'm not sure. So that for fetch, simple. You just tell the URL you want to fetch, and then, and we've worked with these a little bit, but not a ton. Then it gives you back a promise, which means it's saying, I'm giving you back something that you can work with and chain these then methods on to do when I return. So what's happening is when this data comes back, that's what this then says is this is asynchronous. Whenever you come back, I want you to execute this method, which takes the response that we got back and calls .json on it. And the reason it's doing that, that comes as part of this response from fetch, is that will convert this response from something that's JSON, which is really just a big string, into an actual JavaScript object. And we can see some of that because I actually have this request going out here. So if I believe it's still going out. It might be broken now. No, it's there. So if we go look at the application, we can see that the request was made. And then if we look at our response, well, it's very nice. It's going to turn it into something useful for us. But here it is already as JSON, something that we can work with. So you don't really get to see it as just the string, but that's what that first bit of that is doing. And so then it says, okay, once I've finished with that, I can use this same then approach. And that then syntax around a promise, it can be a little confusing. I know we've worked with it just a little bit. We can talk more about it later to try and work through some of that. Or I may even have a whole session just talking about working with promises. I'll tell you the truth, I've worked with them for years now, and they work at times. So, and now we want to do something with the actual results here. So what I'm doing is I'm setting some state. I'm setting is loaded to true. I can get rid of this actually. We can act like we're not doing anything with that right now. And then because I knew what the data looked like, right? I've looked at it over here and I know that I have this data property which has what I want. What I did is in my state, I just took the result.data and put it into items, except I changed this now to gifts. So that's just me storing it somewhere in the state for my component. And we've worked with this lifecycle a few times now. So once you've called set state and it actually sets the state, we know it's going to re-render our component because that's sort of that lifecycle of changing the state. And for the time being, we'll ignore some of these other bits. And I have a console log here just so that I can see the data coming back easily when these requests happen.
So Jared, I'll just a little bit. So all the async operations are really useful when you've got slow servers. And sometimes the common pattern is you're calling an API internally. So instead of making a database a call directly to your database, which would be awful. So you abstract it into an API, and then you can control access a lot more for security reasons and a lot of other stuff. But it can be really slow. And one thing I'm not quite sure in the React paradigm is, okay, you've got you'll commonly see it in the on a website with a spinner, just like a waiting state or something like that. So where would you actually render it?
I'll get to that. As soon as after we show a little bit of this, I'll show you exactly that, because that'll get into this loading bit.
Yep.
Or I can add it in even right now. So let's do it because it's not that hard. But yes, like this stuff can take a while to make a request, right? So how are we going to handle that? What are we going to do to support the notion of a request taking a little while to be processed? Well, if we go look at our application right now, we're not doing really anything to handle it. So we're also not showing anything about this request. So maybe we can start with just using this request as a way to show something in the UI, right? We're not even going to show, let's not even make it complex. Let's not show the results. Let's just show something. And before that, let's say right before I make this fetch call, let's tell it that, set my state so that it knows that I'm loading something right now. So this is just saying, all right, before you make the fetch, set the state of your component to is loading, so you know something's loading. And then what we can do is come down into our render here. And all right, we want to do something to indicate that we're loading or something's going on. So why not, let's go ahead and just get rid of this paragraph. And I'm going to just render a div. And say, I want this to say something if I'm loading, right? Like I want there to be something. So I put these curly braces here to escape it back into JavaScript so I can work with some of the JavaScript logic. And I can say like this dot state dot is loading. Work exactly the way I want. Then I want to just say like loading. Like this is a little bit of a trick here I'm doing. Let's see if this works.
Or you never set it back to.
Oh, hold on.
False. It's done loading.
Yeah, this isn't going to, I don't think this will work the way I want because of how it works. But so let me change this code just a little bit. Let's make this whole thing a bit of JavaScript code, right? In the middle of this. So let's just go ahead and embed this. And in fact, I'm going to use a function because it's really easy to do. So let's say I'll have a render loading that I'm going to call, which is a method on my object. And I'm like, okay, let's add something up here. Render loading. This guy wants to render something if we're loading, but not otherwise, right? So now I can have a simple if block. This dot state dot is loading. So this will be true when we're loading. I do never set it back. I'll fix that in a moment. So if that's the case, I want to return like a div that says loading. Otherwise, I don't need to return anything. I don't want to render anything for that, really. So if we go back here, we should see it there. But as he said, we're never, because I commented the line out up here for setting this to, oh, it was is loaded here. I'll change it to is loading. So let's make sure that we set that to false when we're done loading, right? So now what you saw is a very quick flash of that loading indicator, and that's because our request is going through very quickly. Well, maybe we can try and simulate something that won't go as fast. So let's try a slow 3G connection. This is just something built into DevTools to simulate something. And what we should see now, the whole app's going to take a while to spin up. But that loading is going to stay there for a little while longer because it took us a little while to make that request. It wasn't quite instantaneous. We could simulate that a different way as well. And this gets into just playing with some simulation. So I'm going to simulate that slightly differently. I'm going to simulate it with a little timeout of setting the state. So we're going to give it like 2 seconds after we get the results back and say, all right, you're going to wait a couple of seconds. I think I got something wrong there. Oh, it's because this isn't actually, I didn't make this a proper function. That may not work. We'll see. Oh, there we go. So we sort of simulated a little bit of a delay there for the sake of this app. But that's an example of how you would do something like that. You could also do it much more streamlined inline. I've got this whole render loading guy up here. A common pattern in some React apps is instead of having even the check up here or something like that, you may do it all inline right here where you'll say this dot state dot is loading and this dot render loading, and then you would pull the check out of here, for example. And this is very common or unique to JavaScript. You don't see the same pattern in any other language or most other languages. This is a guard expression, if you will, because you can recall back to when we learned about or and. Blocks in JavaScript, it'll return, like an and block will return the result of evaluating the expressions. So if we were to look, as opposed to true or false. So if we look at this and we say, okay, if the state isn't loading, so we're loaded, then we're going to be done, and it's going to return false from this. But if it is loading, then it's going to return whatever the result is of evaluating render loading. And so there we could just have return div loading, and that's what we'll get back. So that's a pretty common pattern in terms of how you handle something while it's loading. But you can also do it all wrapped up inside of this function like we have up there. That's sort of what you're talking about, is how you would handle something like that?
Yeah.
And a lot of times, again, when you start wanting to get something more complex, all right, well, now I don't want this. This is too simple. I want an actual component, a spinning icon, something. Well, that's just another component, another React component, and you handle it the same way. You'll just do, this dot state dot is loading and loading spinner, a component or something. And then you'll just define what your loading spinner does. And we could even do that right here instead of having it in there. We could jump right up here, define a class of loading spinner, extend our component same way. And maybe it doesn't do anything fancy right now because this is the first version of it that we've rendered. It's just going to do the same thing that we were doing before. It's not actually going to be a spinner. It's just doing this very boring return the loading bit. And we can see the loading sort of sit there for a little while. But now that we've broken it out as a component, it's very easy for us to change what we want to do here and iterate on that entirely separately. So now we're doing something. Now we want to do something when, let's just render something when we actually have got data. So this will be the opposite, not this dot state dot, or let's check this dot state dot items, right? Because that's what we're putting something into, or GIFs, I guess. GIFs, this dot state dot GIFs. So if we have that, then let's just render something very simple here. We'll render a div that says dot GIFs to start with, right? We should see is loading. And then we've retrieved something. Everyone with me so far? So the question is, what do you do next, right? Let's say we want to do something with this data that came back. We don't want to just say got GIFs. We actually want to render the data. Well, we can, this goes back to that pattern we were just using. We can create something that renders GIFs, and I pulled it out of the render method so that I could have a little more logic in there and not have to embed that in my render. And so maybe here, instead of just rendering this div, we'll do this dot render GIFs. I need to change this a little bit. This sort of fits what we have. And we can talk about what's going on in here in a minute, but all right, now we're loading, and we've got our GIFs rendered. So you can see, I mean, really, that wasn't a lot of code that we added to both have a loading element in this and to be able to make a request to an API, get data back, and render it in our app. I mean, this is one line of code. Yeah, it's doing a little bit here. Goes over all of the GIFs, which is an array, calls the map method of the array with each GIF. And then what you get back out of this is an array of image elements with the source set to this on each GIF. And that was, how did I know this is what I wanted to set it to? I just played around with a few things, tried to find something that looked like it worked. At first I tried, if we go look at the data, right? They've got a URL here for each one of them. And I can like open that over here. And this was the first thing that I tried. And then it was rendering, well, it wasn't rendering anything. And then I played around with like trying something in an iframe in case there were some problems. And I noticed it was rendering this whole page. So the next thing I tried was this embed URL. And that still wasn't rendering. And I think it's because it's just, I wasn't giving it any size dimensions, so it was too large to show them. So instead of playing around with figuring out how to set some sizes or something, I started looking, what are these other options here? And down here in images, they had some like downsized things saying, oh, here's how large you should be in a downsized. And so I just went ahead and used that as my value. That would be the best thing because I haven't sat down and read through their documentation about what they would recommend. But that gets us started. Any questions so far? What would you, so next things, what do you guys want to do next? Because right now, obviously, there's some major limitations on what we can do here, right? We only search for one thing. That sort of sucks. So maybe we want to be able to search for different stuff, right? And this gets into, you know, we're building out a little bit of what this other project would be, but how would you go about, you know, being able to search for different things? Any ideas?
You need a component for a search bar.
Let's create a, we'll do it as a whole component. I'll write all this out. And then what do we, like, let's start this thing off. What do we want to render? Probably an input field.
Yeah.
Right? So I'm going to do some, probably want an input of some kind. And I don't know, I can't remember what my types are for an input. That's right or not. Gonna start yelling at me. There's no corresponding closing tag. Oh, let's just close this guy right here because it's just an input. Then we probably want to render our search bar up here somewhere, right? Like maybe above this. Close it. And let's see what we get. I don't know what's going to happen. So we got some sort of search bar that showed up over here, but obviously these things showed up right next to it. That's because these are, I'm just rendering these images sort of inline. So maybe I should, maybe these images should get a little more complex. They should be wrapped in divs. And this is me just being very, very lazy, but that gives them block notations. So I don't think stuff will render next to them now. So there we go. We've got a little search bar up here. But it doesn't have anything in it right now, and it's not like we can type something, but it doesn't do anything. What else? I mean, would you want a button? We probably want a button to go with our search up here, right? So let's put this whole thing, because React normally will only let you do one top level component in something. Let's create a div with an input and a button. Gets into the areas that I just don't remember the exact stuff for, and I always pull up a reference for when I have to do it. So we're going to do that in just a moment. But let's see, is a button, is it like text equals, is this the right thing? Probably not, but let's try it. Is it label? Look at what a button has. It's name. Oh man, or you could put something in the middle. Okay, so let's render a button. This way it won't be self-closing, and then we can say search. And let's see. All right, we got a little search button, but nothing's hooked up for these, right? Yeah. So now, let's keep building on this real fast. What would we need to do? We want some sort of action to happen when this button's clicked, right? Unclick equals what? All right, like, what do we want to do?
You have to link that up to the input.
What? You have to link it up to the input?
Yeah. No?
Yeah. In some respect, we want to do something, right? So let's usually what you do when you're building something out like this, like a search bar, is you say, all right, this onClick, this should, and I should use this syntax, this should call some method on this search bar, right? So we could call the method on here onClick. And this dot onClick is what we want to call then. So now we're sort of hooked up to this. So now if we want to, we could test this, right? Really easily. Let's do it. Just see what's going on. Let's go over to the console. Let's see if we, yeah, we're clicking the button. Pretty simple, except now we want to actually do something when we click it of some kind. Now this gets into a little bit of a React discussion and how you would build something like this out with React, which is different than a lot of other types of applications. Now we talked about this a little bit, this concept of controlled components. So you've got these, where is it? Is it in the, it's not in the installation, it might be in here. Components handling events, nope. Might be in forms, but you've got controlled components where React really prefers if it's a lot easier, I would say, or a lot more React-like if instead of you reading stuff out of the DOM, you have your stuff be a controlled component that React deals with. So let's take this input and change it a little bit. Let's add an onChange handler to it. And each time we change our input here, let's update some information in our search bar. Components, part of our state, which means we're going to have to make this whole thing a little more complex now, because now we need a constructor to set up our state. Now we have to call the super version of the constructor. And now let's set up our state somehow. And let's give it let's call it the search term. And it's null at first. So it's nothing. But whenever we change our, whenever we fire onChange, this is actually an event, and it gets the event for it. And we want to handle that change off the event. And the event will have a target, and that target has a value. That's just getting down into the DOM and the components of it. So we can, if we wanted to test that before we did hook it all up, we could test it by saying event.target.value just to see what happens for each one of these on changes. We need to hook it up down here. This dot on change is what we want to call. So let's see if that's going to be updating when we type stuff. Looks like it is. So now instead of console logging, let's update our state. This dot set state. Search term is event.target.value. This is going to cause a problem for us because we just called it this method in here, and this gets into just an annoying React thing. So we have to do this little really awkward bind bit up here. This dot onChange equals this dot onChange dot bind to this. Make sure that the this context in here is the correct one. This has to do with JavaScript and React, and just annoying.
Otherwise, they're gonna.
Otherwise, if I get rid of that,
Go to the,
it won't see the this object correctly. So if we do that and we try, it's going to throw errors because this doesn't exist. So this is just a way of making sure it's bound correctly. And now, well, we're not seeing anything, which is fine, but let's change our behavior when we click our button now. Instead of logging that, let's log this dot state dot search term just to make sure that we have access to it, sort of building this out bit by bit. And we can, oh,
you have to bind that.
I didn't bind that, right? See? Just this dot on click equals bind this. This is just some of that annoying React garbage.
That's sort of like the import messages up top. Just like
Well,
each individual.
it's a little different. It's because you could write it out in a different way, but it's because they don't JavaScript, when they introduced the class syntax, didn't do any sort of auto binding that you defined on it in the scope. So if they get called from something using, essentially if they get called using a path that is too much of the information, then it can lose its binding, and React always calls all those methods that way. It's calling them from somewhere else. So you have to bind it up with that sort of context that way. So awesome, now we're doing the hello. So we know we're doing that, but I presume we want to do something different on click, right? What do we probably want to do when we click this?
Search.
Do a search, right?
Find the gifs.
Find the gifs, yeah. Except this is where we get to something interesting at this point, right? Is the search isn't being done in this search bar component. Where are we searching right now?
What are we searching?
Where is the search happen? It happens down here in the app right now, right? And it happens in this component did mount. Well, that's not going to work for us. So let's take all this search from the component did mount, and let's pull it out and put it somewhere else. Let's call it let's just call it search. And let's even have it take in the search term. So now I'm going to take all of the logic that we had here and move it down into this. Could call it perform search if we want, and we're going to need to bind this up. Just like anything else, this dot search equals this dot search dot bind to this. And what we probably want to do here is we still want to do a search initially when we load, at least for the time being. So let's just call this dot search here. And I have it take the search term, but I haven't changed it yet because I'm trying to do this bit by bit. So let's see what happens. Well, it looks like that worked just fine. So it's calling the search method just fine from up here. Now maybe we can work with this search term and maybe set something. Well, what were we doing before? We're doing Ryan Gosling, and it's in this string here. Let's turn this into a template literal. And that gives us the opportunity to inject other bits of strings in here. So this right here is probably our search term, right? Like that's what we want to actually be there, is whatever our search term is. Now, I want to have some sort of default value. So what I'm going to do is set a default up here. Say if you don't get anything passed in, this is your default search term. But then I can just use the template literal syntax here and put my search term in. So now we've got, it's still doing the same thing. We haven't hooked anything else up yet. We're doing our search that same way, but we've got a function that can be called separately from component did mount, where a search can be made, right? And down here in our render for our app, we call our search bar. So sort of in React style, how could we have our search bar call that method in this app? When you're building a React app like this, how do you send something like that into its child component so it knows what to do?
It's like objects.
I mean,
The
it's
same behavior.
it's like an object. It's like it's like an element, a class, or an HTML element. Here, you just pass in a prop. So if we want this search bar to have access to this search, we can define a pure search bar. I expect a property passed into me that I'm going to call to search, right? And so that might be this dot props dot, what do we want to define it as in here? We could say on click, or we could say perform search if we want, and say, I have a perform search property on me. So when something should pass that in, and whenever this, I'll handle it and call that when I need a search done or whatever. Or we could call it on click. Try and make this little thing more generic so it doesn't know what's happening when you click that button. So that might be useful. And then what we'll pass in is this dot state dot search term, right? And if we were trying to make this really generic, this probably wouldn't know that it's a search term. It may just know it's a value. So let's make that change in here. This is sort of the evolution of how you do some of this stuff. You go, you know what? This little input and button, that's generic. That doesn't care that a search is being done. All it knows is I've got an input, and when this button's clicked, I want to do something with the value from it. So maybe we'll just call this the value, or maybe we'll call it input value. So it sort of makes sense, right? And I just changed it all in all the places that we had it right here. And now the interesting thing is this search bar is generic. It has nothing to do with doing a search from like Giphy. We could reuse this search bar component in a different app and have all that logic self-contained, and something else could call it and do something entirely different. But we do know that it takes in an on-click property now, right? So if we come back down here, we can say, oh, this search bar, it expects an on-click property. And what we want that on-click to be in this case is this dot search, right? This function that we defined right here. So let's give that a go. Let's see what happens. So we're doing our search by default, and now maybe, let's see what happens. We'll click this. And we saw the little loading, and now we got a bunch of hellos. But you notice there was something wrong there, right? Like, what was wrong? I feel like it was wrong at least. So I do the search for goodbye. I can click search. You see loading, and then stuff's there. But did anything feel wrong? It still had the old stuff there while it was loading. Yeah, I feel like that wasn't right? So we can fix that really easily. Let's go look at what we do when we search. What's the first thing we do is we set our state to is loading. Or we set is loading in the state. We're not, remember, it only mixes that in with whatever's already there, right? So when are we rendering stuff? Well, we're rendering stuff whenever our state has a value for GIFs. So maybe the solution to this is when we start loading, set GIFs to null so that there's no value for it anymore. So now when it comes down here to re-render, it's not going to render any GIFs because we changed its state. So I don't know. Search for pizza. Now okay. Now it looks like, sure. We're starting to look like, that's ridiculous. Like an actual app, right? But that, I mean, all of this is just the whole point of this was really to sort of introduce this idea of working with any API, and then we just built some very, very simple stuff up around it. You can see how easy it was for us. This didn't even get into any extra libraries, any other complex stuff. We built a very, very basic app. Now you could pull something in, do some styling. We're not doing any error handling, which you would definitely want to do. So if we had an error when we made our request, what should we do, etc. But this is what working with APIs let you do, is sort of pull in stuff from other sources into your application.
What about the error part?
The error?
Yeah. How that works?
You would do that very much like we did the loading, right? You would check and say like, oh, so probably what you would do is set something in your state.
So in this case, if the API don't find the value, the text value, they can.
Yeah, you might set something if it doesn't find something, but you'll probably do it more likely if you give it some invalid input. It might actually cause an error, and that's when you might do that. So let me see if I can do that. I don't know if this is going to cause an error or not. It might. No, it worked. But if you did trigger an error of some kind with your request, and they may even have a way to test that, or we could probably also test it by letting it do something like timeout here. Like say we're offline now. It would just take probably a long time to generate the error. But there should be some sort of timeout that's like, I failed to get, here we go, it failed, right? Failed to load the response. Like this is an error that occurred. And that's where you would want to have some logic, which we're not doing anything with right now, down here. Like maybe you do something off of this when you get back in error. You want to show something specific in here. Okay, I'll add a little bit of logic here that's like, this dot state dot error and div into div, and we'll just say something went horribly wrong. I don't know, right? Now it's just blowing up because I took the whole thing offline. I don't know if it's going to give me an error if I try this, but an actual error that will come back. There we go. You can see something went horribly wrong. But we also see some other problems with our state here, right? Like, oh, we probably didn't reset. Let's go see what happened. Oh, that's because this was calling is loaded, and this is, we changed it to is loading, and we want that to be false. So we weren't resetting everything, right? But that's, your error handling would be something like that. Now there is a newer way to handle errors, which, if you write enough React apps or things in React, you might get to, because React also now has a way to handle errors in the render. Like say an error happened, then it's a different path and a little bit different way to handle it. But this is the more common way to deal with something like that. So that was, that was a little bit of a hands-on example of doing a lot of little things, but
why those gifs is still
he has a default.
I have a default request, and I'm making a request in component did mount still. I'm calling this dot search, and I've got a default value here.
So if we don't want that, just erase that part and that's it.
Yeah, I could get rid of the call here in component did mount, and now it's not going to have anything there initially. But that's, and there's a lot more to working with APIs, right? This is one small API, one tiny little bit of working with it. But there are, thousands, tens of thousands of APIs out there that you can work with to get data from. So a real quick example here, we go over and look at this. This is a GitHub page. Todd Motto is just a developer, and he's got a list of public APIs. So you can say, man, I'm really interested in a public API around what?
Music.
Around music. So here's some different public APIs around music that we can go get stuff from. Bands in Town. I don't know what this is. So let's go take a look at it. Here's a little documentation of their API. They tell you if you want to use it, you need to pick an application ID. Make sure you follow some Facebook policies. Right, it may take me a little bit longer to, oh, here's, to get used to how to use this one. Base URL, rest.bandsintown.com. So they say, you know, you should really have access or have contacted them, but you could, looks like it's possible to maybe try it out. So let's see if that works. So here you can search for some sort of artist. I don't know. What's a band name? It might actually have something in town anytime soon.
No idea.
No clue. You know, and then you can say, here's our app API. And here's how to make that request, and here's what the response would look like from them. So here's the actual example of the request. Here's the response. And I presume you could, it looks like you can get their actual events too if you want. So that was just getting the artist, but you know, if you did the same thing.
Let's see.
Yeah. Thank you. And you can give some sort of date range. I don't know if you have to or not. We'll see. It might air out, it might not. And then what we get here now is a little bit different. It's giving us, here's the description with some information about each one of them, including when it's at and URL for information about it, where to get tickets, whether they're already on sale, etc. So that's I mean, that's really, this builds the backbone of a lot of, you know, when you're building out more complex, fully featured applications as opposed to one, you know, just self-contained things. A lot of times you're working with some sort of APIs of some kind, getting data from something else, right? So, as you said, there's just all sorts of them. There's government ones, there's games and comics. So you can get comics or comic book pictures, and you can get food and drink information from different ones. Geocoding, here's government APIs of various kinds to pull into your application. The deal with working with APIs is amazing and powerful to work with them, but you also have, each one of them is usually going to have their own structure of their data. So you're going to have to build out your app to talk to the different structure of each bit of data, right? Any questions about working with APIs? Anything that you really think, oh man, I really want to see an example of working with that?
Can we add not just one API inside of the same website? Or?
Oh yeah, yeah. You could have more than one. So let's let's find an example. I don't know. Let's try news. Let's see what this looks like. So here's it's weird. Does this one already embed the? Oh, these are different formats. Here we go. Here's a different format. So there's an example of a news one with some stuff, and so you could easily have like, let's add that in here, and let's change this now and call this search Giphy, and the only place I think we're referring to that anywhere is right here. We pass it in. So we need to rename it. And we were using it here, but let's say we're not anymore. And now let's add, and I'm going to be a little bit lazy here, a good programmer. Cut and paste some stuff. In fact, I'm going to be even lazier. I'm just going to steal this whole thing right now. But this one won't be search Giphy. It will be search news archives. And we're going to have a different search term here. I don't know. As our default, and then we'll have to go look at what was this one looks like it's completely public. So unlike the other structure that we were using, we don't have to have an API key for this. So I'll just go ahead and come in here and just put this directly in here, and then we can sort of build out how we want this to work, right? Like it looks like this is the terms bit. So let's put our search term in there. And if you're building something more complex, you're not going to just use a string literal and inject something in there, because you're probably going to have a lot more options, a lot more variability. You'll have to build some functions around working with your API. But we're doing something very simple here, so I'm going with a pretty simple approach. Let's see, we've got this search term. Now we've got some results, but we want these to go in a different place, right? This is loading too. And we'll just call this, the results going to news, but they're not structured the same way. It's called items in here. So we'll say items going to news. We'll say is loading news, so that we have something different in all of that. And then now we've got a separate function. See you later.
Bye.
And we could easily, call this as well whenever we want. Like I could put this up in the component did mount. And show the results somewhere, right? Like this state news math. And then I don't know what we're going to do with it. And I don't know what. Let's go look at this real fast. So for items, what do we have here? County, subject, title. Yeah, this may not give us, something really useful for us just right off the bat. But we could look for.
You return like title normal and then the URL. Maybe. You can build links.
What's that? Oh,
Maybe you could return like title, there's like title normal, and then the URL for the, and you can build links out to the articles.
so like, you mean instead of getting back this, or
No, from the object.
from the object? I'm like, I don't see it.
There's title normal is one of the properties in items.
Why am I blind?
Right there.
Title underscore normal.
Thank you. Like this, yeah.
I don't know what that means, but maybe that's.
I don't. Yeah, you could pull off, whatever you want here. Like you can see, this is actually a link to, I don't know, some more on it, and it may not have everything, but it looks like there's bits of information. Like let's see if we get something different if I did do this. Like, what am I going to get back? It's like way too much. So here's some of them have actual content, like some essay stuff in them. Still title normal. So yeah, we could choose whatever we want out of this data and render it. Here. So news item dot title normal. And I'm sure something went horribly wrong. Because I didn't bind this guy up here. Oh, because this is wrong. This dot search. Search Giphy, and this dot search news archives. A little bit of busy work here. And probably gonna take a while to get back the. Oh, I'm not calling it anywhere, am I? I'm not actually showing it. So call render news if I've done that. And somewhere in here, I must still be setting is loading. Oh, right there. Let's change that to news. So it'll be a different loading. So we're not going to see the loading. Okay, property map wasn't defined. My data structure must have been a little different than I thought. Data. Oh wait, wrong thing.
In items.
It's in items. Yeah, I thought I was doing items for this, but maybe I wasn't. Result.items. Oh. I'm putting this in news. That's what's wrong. I think. No. I don't know for sure. This .state.news.map. Welcome to Doing Stuff Live. Items looks like what I want. This is a no-off. It's very mad at me.
Is it that render news?
I'll change this real fast. I'm guessing this is just taking. Never finishing. Let's see. I don't know. I got everything. I got items. Comes back. Here it is. Yeah, I just have something wrong in here. Is loading news, search Giphy.
Is that news item supposed to be?
You know what it
what's
is?
returned from the AP?
Turns the statement. It's not rendering.
News item.
Yeah, it's an either.
It has to be just news.
It can be whatever it needs to be.
You need the curly braces around it.
I don't need them. They're optional. I don't know.
Yeah.
I had something off. I can try one more thing and see if it fixes it, but I don't think so. I don't think I need to do this. No. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. No clue. I'm just doing something wrong in here. I'm logging my result there. I see it. Here's my items. Result.item set to news. This dot state dot. Oh. This is what's wrong. There we go. Oh, and I didn't like news. Yeah, that's because this needs to be. Escape this podcast. There, sorry. Like titles. And that doesn't interfere with our ability to do our Giphy stuff as well. So I went a little longer than I intended in terms of talking. I'm going to, for anyone actually watching the video, I'm going to stop it. If people have more hands-on questions, we can follow up with those